Pirate ships are dirty places to be. There's no arguing with that. It was just a fact of life that pirates stank, they ate terrible food, didn't clean their teeth, and absolutely didn't have flushing toilets. All of those factors combined must have made a pirate ship a disgusting place to live, but imagine crossing that level of poor sanitation with a hospital ward. Pretty much a match made in hell, right? Unfortunately, that was often the case when a ship caught a case of the bloody flux, a devastatingly common illness that seemed to be a ship's curse. If one person started showing symptoms of the flux, it would spread throughout the whole crew and wipe them out. But what even was the bloody flux? What did it look like? And why did pirates fear it so much? Welcome to Walk the Plank. A flux by any other name. Flux means a flow of something, whether that's blood, humours, or diarrhea. Pirate surgeons were incredibly worried about people coming down with the bloody flux, or as we know it today, dysentery. Dysentery was a killer for pirates stuck on a ship hundreds of miles from port and the nearest physician. Some ships would have had a surgeon's chest and someone acting as a ship's doctor, but not every ship. Unfortunately for pirates, dysentery is also an incredibly common and contagious disease that thrives in places with poor sanitation and hygiene. One privateer reported an ongoing case of the flux that struck his ship after leaving Puerto Seguro in the early 1720s. He described how previously healthy members of the crew came down with a sickness that got them in the guts. He blamed it on their diet of sweet meats, dried beef, and coarse flour, as well as complaining that they'd lost their medicine in a shipwreck the previous year. The mortality rate on board their ship was high enough that they had to bury 2 people in one day, with people taking weeks to recover, if they recovered at all. Causes. With such a deadly disease stalking the decks, surely physicians knew how to stop people from coming down with the flux. Unfortunately, it wasn't the case. In the golden age of piracy, most doctors still believed in humours and thought that letting blood or making people vomit were sensible ways to treat illnesses. As they didn't know that dysentery was caused by poor sanitation and bad hygiene, pirates blamed everything under the sun, including living in a hot climate, drinking wine, or even just eating too much. Let's take a look at some of the things that pirates believed caused the bloody flux. Food and drink. Getting the runs from badly prepared food or untreated water is a common enough issue these days that most people know how to avoid it. In the golden age of piracy, the story was completely different, and pirates had a completely different reason for blaming their diet for dysentery. William Cockburn was a surgeon at the time who claimed that unwholesome food, i.e. pork and mushrooms, would mean that dysentery lay in your very near future. His logic was that food that stopped you from sweating would upset your body's natural balance and make you vulnerable to the flux. Another surgeon suggested that raw food was to blame for pirates' tendency to contract dysentery. His reasoning went that your body's internal systems couldn't cope with digesting uncooked fruit and vegetables, once again unbalancing your humours and making you a candidate for dysentery. He wasn't totally wrong in his claim that fruit is a risk factor for dysentery though, since eating unwashed and uncooked fruit and vegetables can give bacteria an easy way into your body. One privateer believed that immoderate consumption of fruit would lead to the flux, while a physician on another ship claimed that it's the fact that white people's guts aren't used to such exotic treats like bananas and pineapples. In his mind, white people can't digest this type of food properly, and so are left with a disgusting sounding viscid glary matter in their guts. We all know that it can be dangerous to drink untreated water, especially when you're on holiday. Traveling to different countries can expose you to bacteria and lead to spending far more time in the bathroom than out exploring, but you can avoid that pretty easily by drinking bottled water and avoiding dodgy looking restaurants. On the other hand, pirates didn't have that luxury. It was impossible for a pirate crew to carry enough water to last them for months at a time, and they had to rely on topping up their supplies as they landed in local ports. Without knowing how to treat the water to remove the local bacteria strains, the pirates would have topped up their barrels and sailed off with a few more passengers on the ship than they bargained for. Interestingly, most physicians at the time blamed alcohol instead of water for causing dysentery, claiming that pirates who consumed too much wine or beer in hot weather would bring you to the flux. And although it's true that drinking too much can lead to diarrhea, a daily tot of rum wasn't really what brought on a bout of dysentery. The weather. You wouldn't have thought that pirates would be precious about the weather, bearing in mind that they lived the majority of their life exposed to the elements. However, many pirates complained bitterly about being forced to live in damp conditions and deal with sudden changes in temperature and climate. A huge number of physicians at the time blamed bad air for any number of diseases, including dysentery. Entertainingly, pirates blamed any and all types of climate for dysentery and diarrhea, including cold weather, damp conditions, changeable weather including storms, and even hot weather. Medicine. Medical treatments in the 16th and 17th centuries could be as bad as the disease itself in some cases. Most pirate ships wouldn't have had a dedicated doctor, instead relying on a man who could read and may have access to some medicine and a rudimentary first aid kit. They also didn't really have an understanding of how the body worked, instead believing that the human body relied on a balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The flux was often related to an excess of yellow bile or cholera, which was often brought on by bad diet or exposure to bad weather. That meant that to treat the disease you needed to balance the body's humour to restore good health. Simply put, you needed to get rid of whatever humour was throwing everything out of whack, which often meant purging the body either by bloodletting or expelling them in some other way. One surgeon complained that this practice of purging patients often led to a dangerous looseness if patients were given too much medicine, and said that this would cause the flux. Amputation. In a truly wild leap of logic, physicians of the time even blamed amputation for causing dysentery on board pirate ships. They arrived at this conclusion by following the logic that somebody who's had a limb amputated will still eat the same amount of food and create the same quantity of blood that he did before, but now the blood has nowhere to go. And since there is too much blood in the body, it has to go somewhere, and in some physicians' mind this naturally had to be from your butt. Makes total sense. Another physician called William Cockburn easily discredits this theory by pointing out that if dysentery were necessary to get rid of the excess blood in the body, it would happen more regularly. Unfortunately, not everyone got the memo though, and treatment options for dysentery varied widely throughout the years. Symptoms. These days, dysentery is more of an inconvenience than the life-threatening disease that struck fear into pirates' hearts and bowels. It's still dangerous, especially for infants and the elderly, and can even kill you if you're very unlucky. There are actually two types of dysentery: amoebic and bacillary. Amoebic dysentery doesn't really have visible symptoms, but can cause an abscess if the parasite causing the illness moves to a different part of the body. Far more common for pirates was bacillary dysentery, where a foreign bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli gets into your body and starts an infection. If you've ever had gastroenteritis, then you've had a taste of how awful dysentery can be. Dysentery is basically a really bad form of gastroenteritis that brings on bouts of high fever, nausea and vomiting, as well as severe bloody diarrhea. Pirates with dysentery would have been racked with debilitating stomach cramps that would have made it impossible to eat or drink, leading them to lose weight quickly and perhaps even die from the disease. A physician at the time described it succinctly, saying that it is a flux with gripping and pain all over the body, wherein is voided blood mixed with liquid excrements, and with them are sometimes a mucus or slimy substance, and sometimes a substance more fleshy. It spreads when infected fecal matter gets into someone else's mouth. That doesn't mean that you're literally eating poo if you come down with dysentery, but it does mean that fecal particles got into your mouth somehow. The disease can transmit in a few different ways, but most likely would have happened in the kitchen. Hand washing absolutely wasn't a key pirate practice, and it only took one person to not wash their hands after going to the toilet to spread it throughout the whole ship. It could also spread through contaminated drinking water or during sex. It's not surprising to learn that many pirates died from dysentery. Once it took root among the crew, many would fall sick and die. Many pirate surgeons blamed the death on other surgeons, saying that with proper care the men would have survived. Others said that there was a point where death was inevitable, including one gruesome symptom: gangrenous guts. Treatment. Treating dysentery was apparently a deep concern for surgeons at the time, particularly a man called John Woodall, who wrote a lot about the bloody flux. He bemoaned the treatment of dysentery in the Indies, claiming that it was a deadly disease that killed many people due to the willfulness and disorder of the patient, as well as the surgeon's ignorance. His greatest concern for sailors was that they were comfortable when suffering from dysentery. He advised people to keep decent toilets on board the ship, as well as a couple of brass pails for men to sit on when they got too weak to move to the prow and use the latrine there. Woodall warned against a truly horrifying, quote, falling down of the arse guts. Possibly he's describing a prolapse where part of the rectum would fall out. So treating men with dysentery was clearly important to avoid such a disgusting end, as Woodall claimed that this falling down would easily be the death of the patient. Unfortunately, there were as many treatments for the flux as there were causes, and about as accurate. As we said earlier, most pirate ships didn't have a physician on board and didn't have access to medicine, which meant they often resorted to bloodletting, opium to deal with the pain, and egg boiled in brandy or fumigating the air around the patient. Dysentery was, and still is, a horrendous disease that can lay you out for days at a time as you try to recover while feeling like the world is falling out of your ass. Pirates were incredibly vulnerable to this disease as they often had to contend with poor diet, contaminated water supplies, and crowded conditions that meant that keeping away from the flux was basically impossible. It's no wonder that many captains would turn their ship around as soon as one case was reported, instead of dealing with the bloody flux out on the open seas. Thank you for watching this episode of Walk the Plank. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Have a great week. Cheers.